If you quickly look up the date when humans first set foot on the moon, you'll find July 20th, 1969. But that's only part of the story. The truth is, we reached the moon in several ways before Neil Armstrong ever stepped on it. Before I begin, there's a cool surprise from Oral-B at the end of this video, so stick around. Let's go back to the year 1959. In 1958, Elvis Presley was a huge sensation, serving in the United States Army in Germany at the peak of his fame. Meanwhile, in Brazil, João Gilberto had just released Chega de Saudade, marking the birth of Bossa Nova. The streets were full of vehicles like this 3,100 pickup truck. All of this was happening during the Cold War, with the United States leading the capitalist side and the Soviet Union leading the communist side. One of the ways they tried to prove which system was superior, capitalism or communism, was through the space race. So the United States and the Soviet Union raced to see who could go further in space exploration. And in that race, the Soviet Union took an early and commanding lead. In 1957, they had already launched the first artificial satellite ever, Sputnik. And in 1959, they started a lunar exploration program called Lunar. They launched a probe, or rather a robot, right? A probe is a spacecraft with no crew, no astronaut on board, designed to reach the moon. But they missed the mark. It flew past the moon by 6,000 kilometers. But 6,000 kilometers is incredibly close in astronomical terms. Do you know what that means? That by 1959, we already had the technology to calculate orbit, gravity, trajectory, communication, propulsion, everything needed to get to the moon. And the Soviet Union succeeded just a few months later. They launched the Lunar 2 probe, which became the first object that we hurled, well, more or less hurled from Earth to hit the moon. We literally rocketed it from Earth and it impacted the lunar surface. That was the first time we actually reached the moon. But Ibre, come on, sending a tiny robot doesn't really count, does it? That's kind of lame, right? Sure, sending some metal boxes and sensors to the moon doesn't have the same wow factor as sending a person. But still, by 1959, we had already made our mark on the moon. Humanity had already managed to leave something up there. And most importantly, we began scientifically exploring the moon's surface in 1959. But hang on, we went there a few more times before actually stepping on it. In 1959, the Lunar 3 probe took the first photos of the far side of the moon. Technically, it's more accurate to call it the dark side because from Earth we always see the same face. There's a side that's always hidden. And unless a spacecraft like Lunar 3 goes behind the moon and takes pictures, we'll never see it. So for the first time in history, humankind was seeing a side of the moon that can't be seen from Earth. A little while later, in 1961, the Soviet Union scored big by sending the first human into space, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin. He was called a cosmonaut because people flying for the Soviet Union were called that. In the United States, they're called astronauts. Yuri Gagarin completed one full orbit around Earth in 108 minutes, flying at 28,000 kilometers per hour. His historic phrase was, "The Earth is blue," as he was the first to see it from space. Meanwhile, the United States was also making progress. Not long after, they sent their first American into space, launched the Apollo program to send a human to the moon, and President Kennedy made a historic speech promising to do it before the end of the decade. In 1964, they created an incredibly detailed map of the moon's surface with more than 4,300 images using the Ranger probe, which then crashed into the moon. And guess who pulled off the first rough landing on the moon? The Soviet Union. They sent the Lunar 9 probe. It crashed onto the moon too, but before impact it released a capsule filled with cushions. It bounced and bounced and bounced until it stopped, and then took the first photos of the moon's surface. The next probe, Lunar 10, became the first object humanity put into orbit around the moon. In other words, we put a satellite around our own natural satellite. Right after that, finally paving the way for humans, the United States pulled off the first soft landing. They sent Surveyor 1, a probe equipped with retrorockets, meaning rockets that fire downward, allowing it to land gently. And this was still in 1966. By then, we had already done flybys and crash landings, taken pictures of the far side, mapped, orbited, and landed on the moon. But now comes the most exciting part. The United States' Apollo program was already highly advanced. They had built this stunning rocket you see here. It was called Saturn V, the largest rocket ever built by humans. The Soviet Union actually designed an even bigger one, the N1, to go to the moon too, but it never worked properly and was never successful. Sergio from the Space Today channel told me a great story about that rocket. I'll leave the link here. It's an awesome channel about astronomy and space exploration. Check it out. The first time that rocket flew with a crew, real people on board, it was already on a mission. And this is one of the most beautiful moments in space history. The astronauts launched in December '68, heading for the moon. Yes, the moon. 3 astronauts were set to make the longest journey any human had ever made. Saturn V launched on December 21st, and they entered lunar orbit on December 24th, Christmas Eve. As they passed behind the moon, there was a moment when the Earth began to set on the horizon. We're used to seeing the sunset, but this wasn't the sun. This was the moon's horizon, and it was Earth that was setting behind it. And you know what they did? They went live on television from the spacecraft, showing the Earth setting. They did a live broadcast from lunar orbit and read a passage from Genesis, the first book of the Bible. Hold on, just imagine this. It's 1968, a live broadcast from space showing the Earth setting behind the moon's horizon, and the astronauts reading, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." You can follow any religion or none at all, but let's admit it, that's beautiful. It's deeply symbolic. So on that mission, Apollo 8 in 1968, humans reached the moon for the first time. But Ibere, we didn't set foot on the moon in 1968, right? Yeah, we hadn't actually stepped onto the regolith, the moon's surface, just yet. But honestly, we were already there. On Apollo 9, the astronauts used that same rocket again, but only ran tests in Earth's orbit. They didn't go far. And on Apollo 10, they went back to the moon. Same trip as Apollo 8. They got there and released the lunar module, the little ship that would eventually land. That ship came really close to the moon's surface, but didn't land. The astronauts returned to Earth, and then came Apollo 11, where they used that big rocket to its full potential. This is where the story of Saturn V and the first human landing on the moon begins. On July 16, 1969, Saturn V launched from Cape Canaveral, Florida, carrying 3 astronauts. This whole massive rocket, look, nearly touched the ceiling. But less than 3 minutes later, all 770,000 liters of kerosene and 1,200,000 liters of liquid oxygen stored in this part of the rocket were gone, not lost in space. By then, the rocket was still under 70 kilometers high, but already used up. That meant they had to discard the first stage of the rocket, this entire section here. Then the second stage fired. Right after that, they got rid of the escape tower, the little rocket at the tip, meant to eject the astronauts if something went wrong. It would pull away the command module, which is where the astronauts were during liftoff. Since nothing went wrong, they could discard it. A few minutes later, the second stage was also dropped, and the third stage ignited, putting the spacecraft into Earth's orbit. Then, less than 3 hours after launch, the third stage fired again, and the spacecraft left orbit, heading for the moon. On the way from Earth to the moon, they had to perform a pretty wild maneuver. Here's the third stage of the rocket, and here are the service and command modules. In between, there was a cover that opened just like this, and inside was the lunar module, the little craft that would descend to the moon. Here's the crazy part. After that cover opened, the command and service modules detached, turned around and docked with the lunar module. Then this section was discarded. The spacecraft's final shape had the engine, the service module, the command module, and the lunar module up front. It flew like that. The shape didn't matter. There's no air in space, so you don't need aerodynamics. So really, who cares about the shape of a spaceship? The important thing is that the astronauts only had access to 3 compartments. The rest of the rocket consisted of fuel and engines. 3 days later, they entered the moon's orbit. One question we always get here at Manual do Mundo is, how did they go to the bathroom? They had a bag for pooping, and for peeing, there was a kind of condom connected to a reservoir. All of this in 0 gravity. So just imagine if something floats away. The astronauts also had to brush their teeth. No one wants to come back to Earth with bad breath and cavities. Each astronaut took a kit with dental floss, toothpaste that could be swallowed so there'd be no waste to spit out, and 2 Oral-B toothbrushes. Back then, the classic, the one in the commercial, was the most high-tech. Today, technology has advanced a lot, and Oral-B's most powerful product is that electric toothbrush we took apart in the What's Inside video. It's tied to the surprise I'll show at the end. The 3 astronauts spent some time orbiting the moon, checking if everything was working properly, because now things were about to get real. Once everything was ready, 2 astronauts moved into the lunar module and the spacecraft separated. The astronaut who stayed behind in the command and service module became the most alone human being in the entire universe at that moment. Earth was far away and no other humans were nearby. His 2 crewmates descending to the moon would also be far off since the main spacecraft kept orbiting. It would pass behind the far side of the moon. It's kind of sad that this astronaut never walked on the moon, but our focus is on the 2 heading down. Eventually they fired the retro rockets. Even with a detailed map, in the final moments, it came down to eyesight. They had to find the best spot to land. And on July 20th, 1969, astronaut Neil Armstrong became the first human being to set foot on the moon. He said the famous words, "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." Right after him, his crewmate Buzz Aldrin became the second person to walk on the moon. The 2 spent 21 hours there, exploring the lunar surface, taking photos, filming, and planting the American flag on the moon. But wait, how did those 2 little spacecraft get back to Earth? They got back into the lunar module, which then split in 2. The bottom half stayed on the moon and served as a launch pad for the top half, which fired its engines. Up in lunar orbit, the top half rejoined the main spacecraft that had stayed in orbit. The 2 astronauts who had walked on the moon returned and reunited with the one who'd waited. They left the lunar module behind and the remaining spacecraft fired its rockets to begin the journey home. But Iberi, how did they leave using that giant rocket and come back in just this tiny ship? And now they were coming back in this tiny thing? Here's the deal. When they left Earth, they needed all that equipment to escape Earth's gravity. But on the moon, they had already discarded most of it, and to come back, they only needed to escape the moon's gravity. Then, midway through the trip, Earth's gravity took over and basically pulled them back, so it was just falling toward Earth. So the trip back was totally different from the way there. As they approached Earth's atmosphere, they ditched the last part, the service module. Only this capsule, the command module, was built to handle what came next. When it re-entered the atmosphere, the air resistance and intense pressure at the front caused the temperature to skyrocket. It was basically like a meteor entering Earth. Even after all that, the capsule was still falling at a super high speed. So first they released tiny parachutes to stabilize it and slow things down just a bit. Then came the 3 massive parachutes. And finally, the capsule slowly descended until it splashed down into the ocean. Then they inflated flotation devices, and there were aircraft carriers, helicopters, planes, tons of people waiting. And after 8 days in space, the astronauts opened the hatch and took a breath of fresh air. After Apollo 11, we landed on the moon 5 more times. They ran scientific experiments, drove a lunar jeep, played golf, and even found a probe that had landed there. In total, 12 people, all Americans, have walked on the moon. The last time was Apollo 17 in 1972. But I think everything you've said so far is just a lie. Because if back then, with all that outdated tech, they managed to get to the moon today, with smartphones, computers, and the internet, we should have gone back many more times. Humans have gone to the moon 9 times. All of them were Apollo missions. We landed on 6 of those missions. The other 3 didn't land. Apollo 8 was a Christmas Eve mission. Apollo 10 tested the lunar module but didn't land. And Apollo 13, the one from the movie, had an oxygen tank failure, so they couldn't land, but they still made it to the moon. So before we say it's all fake and wonder why we haven't gone more times, we need to remember 3 things. First, we've been exploring the moon with robots since 1959, and we're still doing that today. It's way cheaper and doesn't put any human lives at risk. The second point is that this trip is insanely expensive. The Apollo program, adjusted for inflation, would cost about $130 billion today. Converted into reais, that's about 493 billion. Originally, the plan was to go all the way to Apollo 20, but Congress cut the budget and it ended with Apollo 17. The third thing is that the space race was also a PR war. So once the United States got to the moon and actually set foot there, it was like they had already won. There was no real point in sending people again and again, because it wouldn't make much difference in their rivalry with the Soviet Union. So let's just wait a bit. Maybe in 2030 or 2040 we'll do a video right here at the Manual do Mundo desk, showing how humans made it to Mars. Now what about that Oral-B surprise I mentioned at the beginning? Anyone who watches Manual do Mundo gets a really sweet discount. It's for the PC5000 toothbrush, the one we took apart in our What's Inside video. So if you want a super high-tech toothbrush, it is way more advanced than the one astronauts took to the moon. Just click the link below the video.